Aloha, welcome back to Aina Bear Farm. We're going to do a continuation of our video about setting up a survival garden or improving your garden or a victory garden, kitchen garden, whatever you got going on in these crazy times where you want to supplement some fresh produce for you and your family, or just kind of have that security of having access to calories, proteins, and nutrients. So if you haven't checked out the first video that we talk about the tips for a survival garden, go back and check that out. Covers 3 really good tips for setting up a garden in any zone, any climate. Just things that can help you whether you're a beginner or whether you're just trying to up your game a little bit. And so in this next video, I want to talk about perennial crops versus annual crops. And so just really quick to cover the difference, because I know there's lots of different people with different experiences watching these videos. An annual crop is something that you plant one time, you get a harvest, and then it's done. So the next year you have to plant it again from seed. And so most gardeners usually work with annual vegetables, things like tomatoes and lettuces, potatoes, okra, corn. Those are all annual crops. You plant a seed, you get a harvest, and then it's done. Annual crops are by far the most work. Because every time you have to dig up the soil, remove the plant, replanting and planting is a lot of work. So if you haven't gone through that cycle yet, that's a lot of work. You can get those crops really quickly versus a perennial crop, which we'll talk about in a second. So there are some really good benefits to annuals. They're very tasty. A lot of those things I just named are really, really good staples that we here in the US and a lot of other countries enjoy eating those things regularly. So both are good. I would encourage you to incorporate a little bit of both into your garden. But perennials, you need to know, take a little bit more time. Those are plants where you're going to plant them one time and the plant's going to be there. So you're really never going to have to replant it. I say never, but every plant has a lifespan. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go. But you certainly don't have to plant it every year. You can continually harvest from it. Some of the perennials are called tender perennials, which means that in cooler times or in dormant seasons, they will completely die back, oftentimes all the way to the ground. You won't even really notice they're there anymore unless you know that where you planted them. Other perennials are referred to as woody perennials, meaning that they develop more of a woody trunk to them, kind of like a bush or a shrub. And those will, even if they lose all of their leaves or their more tender parts in cooler or dormant seasons, the main structure of the plant will continue to grow for the life cycle of that plant. So I'm going to walk through our garden today, talk about a few perennials that we have here. I'm going to mostly focus on perennials that you can grow in a lot of different places, but I also want to emphasize a few things that we grow here in the tropics. So if you are in the tropics, or if you just have access to a greenhouse or can grow in some pots, you can try out some of these other plants as well, because they're really great. But I'll start right here with the plant that's next to me. This is an asparagus, and it may not look like asparagus to you if you've never grown it before or seen it in a garden, and you've only seen the shoots that you buy at the store. But this is what the plant looks like when you let it mature. So it sort of ferns out, gets little flowers, and sometimes gets little berries on there. The berries are not edible, by the way. So asparagus is a great plant, but it does take some time. You really need to let it get going for about 3 years before you start harvesting from your crop. And I know that's a long time for most people to wait, but that's why I recommend planting it as soon as possible, because 3 years from now you will find that you will be wishing you had planted asparagus if you didn't, because then you'd be harvesting. So it needs 3 years to really charge the roots up so that you can cut out the shoots when they pop up. For most of us, that's in the spring when you start to get warm weather again. The shoots pop up when they're a good size. You cut off what you want, and eventually you do leave the plant to grow out like this so that it can recharge the roots again for the next year. Oftentimes in the tropics or in warmer weather, you can get 2 harvests from asparagus every year. It's a great plant, but you do need a decent number of them. Even if you could harvest 2 spears at a time from one plant, If you think about that, you go to the grocery store, you buy like a bunch of asparagus, and there's what, maybe 20 spears in there. So do a little math, you'd need 10 plants just to be able to harvest a bunch of asparagus each time you come out. And by my count of growing asparagus for several years, after you start harvesting in their 3rd or 4th year, you could get a bunch of asparagus off of 10 plants about every 2 weeks, I would say, for the growing season. And so if you've got 10 plants, that means you're probably going to harvest about 3 or 4 bunches per season. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a really easy crop to just sort of plant and forget about it. It's also not something, if you have limited space, this doesn't have to go in your garden. It doesn't have to go in a raised bed or those areas. Just stick it somewhere. Put it in with some shrubs or, you know, around some trees. It does need some decent amount of sun, so it's got to be in an area of light, but it doesn't have to take up kind of like your premium garden space. One of the great things about perennials is their roots grow every year. These roots just continue to go deeper and deeper into the soil to pick up nutrients that your annual vegetables aren't able to reach with their short, more spread out roots that they grow in one growing season. So highly recommend asparagus. Take some time. You can buy plants that have already been going. So for example, when I bought this, they call it a third year root. And so really you could probably start harvesting these after they've been in the ground for 1 year. You can also grow them from seed, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. But some great options for any climate, asparagus for sure. The next one that I want to talk about is strawberry. So not a vegetable, but a great perennial crop. And so we've got a bed of strawberries right here. One thing I love about strawberries is you can buy a handful of plugs or little like crowns that have kind of a baby plant sticking out of them. And usually you can buy a crown for like $2 or $3, super cheap. You put the crown in the ground, and you'll see I've kind of spaced these out. And that's because each crown, as the plant grows, will shoot out several side shoots that will put down their own roots and become new plants. So I've spaced these out so that they can grow little baby plants that will grow up, excuse me, and mature into full strawberry plants, each one then creating its own fruit. And a lot of times growers will do that in sort of an X pattern where you have the mother plant right in the middle, and then the little baby is shooting off in an X. Different cultivars, different varieties of strawberries you can grow all over the place, all kinds of growing zones. These happen to be ever-bearing, meaning that they will produce fruit mostly year-round in a warm season like this. You can also get ever-bearing fruits in mainland like continental climates, and they'll produce throughout the growing season, so that for most places like April to October. Really popular option for strawberries is the June-bearing varieties, in which case right around May or June you get a huge crop of strawberries. They go crazy, and then they don't produce strawberries for the rest of the year. Both are great. I recommend either one, but it's another really easy crop. If you have kids, I think you gotta have strawberries, unless they're allergic or something. Kids love strawberries, super fun to watch them grow, to pick. Of course, they're delicious. These are also a great source of nutrition, good source of vitamin C. Yeah, who doesn't love strawberries? Behind me, I've got a couple of cool things. Green onions. These are perennial in a lot of places. Sometimes they would be described as a tender perennial because in the winter they die all the way to the ground. But in a lot of places in a mild winter, they actually don't die all the way to the ground. And I was going to try to separate them out, but I think I'd actually need a little trowel or something to dig with to do that. But the great thing about these types of onions, and these are just like standard traditional bunching green onions, you can break them apart. Like this plant, for example, I could probably break this apart into about 10 different plants if I wanted to right now. Each kind of individual bulb shooting up a few leaves. And then I could turn those into 10 green onion plants. Each one would become this size by the next season. So you can see how they're not only a great constantly growing plant, but they're something that you can very easily multiply. In super colder climates, you may have to bring a couple of these inside in the winter in a pot, something like that, to overwinter them, and then bring them back out. And I know that kind of makes a gray area for the word perennial. Like, are they actually perennial if you have to go through that much work to keep them alive every year? It depends. But just a really good, again, easy staple crop. Not huge in the nutrition department, but add a ton of flavor to all kinds of dishes, and very useful and very easy. Next to me, you might recognize, especially if you're in the tropics or a warmer area, pineapple. Pineapple is perennial with a little bit of maintenance. So each one of these will shoot up a little fruit on the top, and they take about 16, 18 months here in Hawaii. They can take a lot longer than that, depending on where you are and how strong your sun is, that sort of thing. Once you cut the fruit off, but really before you cut the fruit off, the pineapple will send out a lot of different side shoots called suckers. Some will come from the base, some will come from the stems, some will come from right under the fruit. You can break those off and replant them, and again, multiply your crop that way. Once you cut the fruit off of the pineapple, if you leave one strong sucker on that plant, it will continue to form a new head of the plant and then a new fruit. So in that way, pineapple is also perennial and doesn't really require too much care. Again, great nutrients in pineapple. All the, I think they call it bromelain, the digestive enzyme that's in pineapple, is really good for your digestive system. And of course, vitamin C, and who doesn't love some really great juicy pineapple? You can do this in a pot. You can see it's a pretty big plant, so you need a big pot size to bring it in over the winter or to have in a greenhouse. But I know a lot of you in colder climates, like, this isn't even really an option, but I did want to point it out for those that can. So if you follow me this way, we'll point out what some little baby asparagus look like. I grew these from seed. They're a little hard to spot. They're like tiny little pine trees almost. And they're very fragile at their early state. You just got to keep them nicely watered. This is a little bit of top compost, homemade compost on them there. Those are literally going to be probably 3 years from harvesting for that. So that's a really big time investment on that. But love asparagus. And again, like I said, if you have the space, just stick them all over the place. Eventually, I'll be sticking some asparagus into our pasture that we're converting to a food forest. Because why not? We've got a lot of open space before our trees form and fill out the canopy. And may as well just have lots of asparagus to eat, to sell, to give away, all that stuff. So if you follow me this way, we'll talk about a few more ideas for some perennials. In my last video, I mentioned it, but I'll bring it up again, talk a little bit more about it. This is moringa. It needs warm climate. So again, tropical, warm climate, greenhouse. When we were in Maryland, I was so enamored with this tree that I wanted to start trying to grow it in our greenhouse and in pots, bring it inside to see if I could keep it alive over the winter. I wasn't sure. It was going to be kind of an experiment. I didn't know anybody in the area that was trying it. But it's well worth it if you can. They call it the miracle tree, full of nutrients. It's got one of the highest protein contents of any leafy green. And you eat it like a leafy green. You just cut off the branches. You can throw this stuff in a stir fry. You can eat it raw. It's in the mustard family, so it's got kind of that mustard green type of flavor, almost like a spiciness, like arugula or any of the like Asian mustard greens. But a fantastic plant. The whole thing is edible. You have to prepare it in different ways to eat all the different parts. And for a garden like this, it's actually really great because once it gets up to about my shoulder height, I'm just gonna start lopping it off and let it pollard, send out branches that are shoots, and then I harvest those branches. So it stays at a pretty manageable height. Provides a little bit of shade in the immediate area, but I like that. It's a little bit of variation in the garden. And I've already seen birds come and sit and perch on that. And it's just great to do things that can bring in a little bit more diversity in your garden space. Again, If you have a smaller garden space, something like that doesn't have to go in the garden. This can be just part of your regular landscape if you're in a warmer climate. But I want to bring up a few other kind of like shrubbier, small tree type of greens that you can grow that I'm not growing here, so unfortunately I don't have examples of them yet. Some of them I do intend to start trying to grow. But I'll put a list of these in the description so you can check out that list and then maybe look up some of them individually and see some other great videos where people are growing them. They can show you. One is Tongan spinach. There's another name for it that I'm forgetting, but that's a warm weather tropical thing that but you can grow it in the shorter growing season. It's just technically an annual. So kind of messes with our perennial idea there, but it just produces huge edible leaves. There are a lot of edible hibiscus. I have heard people say that all hibiscus is edible, but I know that some of them taste way better than others. But that's another thing that you can grow in a lot of different places that could be perennial depending on where you are. Tree collards. There are a lot of people who are just now getting into tree collards where it's literally like having collard greens on a small tree, on a shrub. So it just keeps producing and producing and producing. A tree that I grew in Maryland that I never got to, I didn't get to see it to full growth, but it's the linwood, basswood. I'm forgetting the name of it now. It's basswood or basswood. But it has another more common name. I'll put it in the description as well. But edible leaves, particularly the new ones that come off in the spring every year, you can just cut them and eat them. So there's all kinds of options out there, and if I think of others, I'll put those in the description as well, where you have these kind of shrubby or tree type plants that you don't have to keep planting over and over and over again, and you can cut off the leaves for a constant supply of perennial vegetables that way. So that kind of covers, all the different types of perennial crops that you can look at. I highly recommend getting some of them in the ground as soon as possible. Get your annuals going first because that'll be the stuff that produces first, but leave some space for perennials if you can. Again, integrate them into your landscape. You probably have heard of edible landscaping because a lot of these look really good as well as being edible, and so you can sort of design them into areas where you have flowering bushes and other non-edible species, but work them in somewhere. Find a space for them if you can, because they really pay off down the road. The next video I want to shoot will talk a little bit more about the bigger perennials, the full-on trees. So we'll talk a little bit more about fruits and nuts. So no doubt about it, you need some space for those things. So I know that's not going to be for everybody who's in smaller areas, but maybe check it out anyways, because you never know. You may be able to find one that's already growing nearby you. The last farm that we moved in had a huge black walnut tree, so we were super lucky with that. I've done tons of videos on how we're converting our pasture here to a food forest, so you can go and check out those right now if you'd like some ideas about all kinds of things that you can grow in the tropics. But we'll be doing one that's a little bit more designed to help people regardless of where they are. Again, crazy times. I hope a lot of you are using some of this knowledge to get out there and plant some things that can just help you feel more secure, help you get some of those nutrients that are sorely needed to keep you healthy, and then just spending more time outside, get some vitamin D in the sun, get some exercise. It's all good for you. So I wish you the best, and thanks for joining us again. We'll see you here next time at Ida Bear Farm. Aloha.